We've got something special coming up. CommonWealth Beacon and Mass Inc. are celebrating 30 years, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Join us on May 14th at the State Room in downtown Boston for an evening with readers, supporters, and leaders from across Massachusetts as we celebrate 3 decades of original independent journalism covering Massachusetts policy and civic life. We'll also be talking about the future with Ali Noorani of the Barr Foundation and Marty Barron, former editor of the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, both sharing their thoughts on how CommonWealth Beacon can help Massachusetts move forward. To learn more and grab your tickets, visit commonwealthbeacon.org/30th or click the link in the episode description. Hope to see you at the State Room on May 14th. Tickets are on sale now.
As Mass Inc., and therefore CommonWealth Beacon, turns 30, it's been a chance to look back and look ahead at one of the defining questions of the organization, be it the independent news arm, the research center, or the polling group. And that question is, who can live and work in Massachusetts? What quality of life can they expect? And what makes that promise easier or harder to achieve through state policy? Yes, that's 3 questions, but they often involve what it means to be, quote-unquote, middle class. And speaking of looking back, we're taking a wander today. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. And while journalism may famously be the first draft of history, the historians have the rest of it locked down. So I'm joined today by Andrew Steele, who teaches in the economics department at the Paul College of Business and Economics at the University of New Hampshire. He's a historian, and Andrew's research is focused on the middle class, specifically how members of the middle class think about their place in society and vice versa. So we're going to have a chat about what a new poll tells us about middle-class anxiety today, where the American dream gloss intersects with the idea of a middle class, and how that then intersects with media portrayals, demographic differences, and political promises. So, Andrew, thanks so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start maybe with the broadest possible question here, which is, as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about the history and kind of the practical ramifications of middle class as a category, is it useful? What is the function of talking about the middle class?
Yeah, I think it is useful, but more importantly, I think it's just unavoidable. Yeah, the comparison that I like to make is with the Midwest, because both of those concepts are really fuzzy at the edges, but they play a necessary role in kind of locking in place our concepts of the other regions in the case of the Midwest, or other classes in the case of the middle class, and people from either the middle class or the Midwest often kind of struggle to identify what makes them belong to that. The essence is unclear, and people disagree when they do have opinions about what really is the essence of the Midwest or of the middle class. So it's not just a boundary question; it's also about the very core, and it's also about how people think about excluding others. They have different reasons that they would give for why somebody isn't part of the middle class or part of the Midwest. And for New Englanders, I'm not a native New Englander, but I think that this way of thinking might be a little bit challenging because we're so used to. I do identify as a New Englander now, but I am from the Midwest, and so I guess I'm in a position to kind of tell the difference. But we know what New England is. It's a pretty sharply defined region, and people who are from that region have no trouble identifying where it stops. And so, I think it's always nicer when we can have those really solid definitions. But there is a utility to those fuzzier concepts as well. And like I said, I think they're unavoidable.
So I'm so glad that you kind of started there, because one thing that I've been turning over in my head is I've been thinking about not just what the middle class has kind of looked like in my experience, in my conception, but also looking at the way that people in this recent Mass Inc. polling group poll sort of define the markers of the middle class. is that it's sort of doing two things at once. It's both defining this core category, what is the middle class, and it's also sort of defined by the things that you're not, sort of to your point there, where you are not upper class, you are not working class, but there is so much blur there that we got definitions from people that range as far from just above blue collar to having a house, being able to go on vacations and owning your own business, like a huge span of how people were defining the middle class. So thinking back to kind of where the middle class sort of sits right now in your conception and your kind of background here, is that inherent to it? Has the middle class always had those kind of fuzzy boundaries?
Yeah, so I think historically and today, it's also an asymmetric issue where a lot more mental and emotional energy goes into trying to create borders, boundaries between the middle class and the working class, even between sort of properly middle class and the lower middle class. Whereas you see less work done, at least on the middle class's part, in trying to establish upper boundaries, right? So I think of four kind of dimensions that, and the poll that you ran, it gets to a lot of these, but four different dimensions that have historically been used to distinguish the middle class. The first is income, but that's not really useful on a kind of everyday level because it's opaque. We don't know other people's income. So while it's useful for sociologists who can run surveys or pollsters, it's not really something that we can observe directly. We can observe consumption. And so like you were saying about houses, having a single family home that's detached has typically been sort of the standard. But that differs quite a bit if you live in a large city. So it's also situational. But consumption is something that is observable and has definitely been a dimension of the middle class that I think is widely used. And then there's also occupation and the distinction between blue collar and white collar. But again, there you see that white collar just is an upward, there's no upper boundary. There's no third collar to distinguish who is truly wealthy. So that the attention is really given towards trying to create that distinction between the middle class and the working class. And that kind of intersects with education, with higher education, which has become increasingly salient as more and more people achieve that marker. And it's also kind of a consumption thing, right? Because obviously it costs a lot of money to go to college. But it's also tied into occupation because, especially now, we are in a society where a bachelor's degree is necessary for entrance into many of the occupations that are considered white collar or middle class occupations. So education is I think increasingly used as a kind of proxy because of the difficulties with the others. But it correlates rather poorly with income. And so we see, the fact that you have these four different dimensions and that you can be middle class on one of them or on two of them or on three of them, but not on all four of them, makes the middle class inherently unstable as an identity. You're always maybe slipping a little bit in one of the four, or maybe two or even three of the four, or possibly all four. But that makes it really difficult to maintain a kind of sense of stability and security. So, I do think that it's a conceptual problem. It's also something that's been there ever since the middle class really started to distinguish itself.
So one of those things that I'd really like to piece into a little bit here is that there are a few different dimensions talking about the middle class. And one thing that I was sort of struggling with and thinking about as you were talking is, to what extent is this something that people want for themselves? To what extent is this something that is promised to people? The idea of, can a state or can a set of policies promise or make better the chance that someone could bank on getting into the middle class? Or is it, can you get these things that you sort of associate with a middle class life? So what is going on with kind of the way that we talk about the middle class as kind of a political concept?
And this is something that is very core to ideas about America and the American dream, and that's a very complicated nexus of individualism versus communitarianism. I think there's a sense that you're really on your own for making the most of your talents, but on the other hand, society should have certain avenues that are equally open to anybody. So it's something that I think we really see a lot of political conflict over, about where the balance of those two forces lies. But I think that increasingly in the past decade or 15 years, I think a new angle has emerged in the sense of the focus on inequality as a real problem. And I think that what has become more sharply identified in the public eye is the very stark differences in terms of the way that generational advantages are passed down among the very wealthy versus the middle class. I mean, one of the ways that we can define the middle class is that there is a lack of generational wealth there, right? Where your parents being middle class doesn't mean that you can coast and stay in the middle class. You have to re-achieve those markers on your own. And that's just not true when you do have generational wealth, right? Generational wealth means that your parent or your grandparent amassed so much wealth that you can't fall out of the very upper end of society, that you have that trust fund that you'd have to be really, really prodigal to run through.
So it seems like you're prodding at something that's really interesting to me here, which is that this precarity that we saw really expressed in the poll, this idea that they kind of felt on the edge, these people that define themselves as middle class, as almost being a kind of like dark definition of the middle class, that that there's almost a paradox in the idea of what it means to be securely middle class. Am I poking at something there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is about the way that the class system for a long time was not set up to have a middle class as a distinct third term within either in terms of the analysis of class or the lived experience of class. The most influential analyst of class would be Karl Marx, of course, and he really believed that the group that would be called the middle class today was vestigial, that it would fade away over time, and that really the most secure definition of class was either you owned property or you had to work and sell your labor. And that leaves no real place for the middle class because they can't successfully differentiate themselves because they do have to sell their labor. And as I was saying, generationally, that repeats. You don't have a free pass through a generation. But the way that the Industrial Revolution produced this class of managers and people in service sector occupations, and that class grew over time, obviously defied Marx's predictions. But it doesn't really resolve any of the conceptual difficulties that we see, starting from that point. And I think that is intrinsic to the middle class. And I think that the lived experience of it is the anxiety of not really knowing, where the true separation from the working class begins.
One of the dynamics in the poll, and also obviously in plenty of research around the middle class, is what I spend a lot of time in my work on, which is housing, kind of housing as a sense of security, housing as, of course, the kind of largest asset many families have. That's where a lot of their equity is. And so there's something that feels kind of very difficult and paradoxical in Massachusetts, but also all over the country, obviously, when the cost of housing is getting so high, but it is also so associated with what it means to be in the quote unquote middle class. So I guess my question is, how does that impact kind of the idea of what the middle is when those things that have been such markers of kind of American dream life have actually become so hard to acquire?
Yeah, I think that housing has been, and not just having a house, but also where you live, has been so tied to middle class identity, dating back to the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of that was about environment, about living in areas that were untouched by the pollution of the factories, and then needing the kind of transportation so that you could live far enough away for that. So, yeah, I think that one of the stark differences that we can see, again, is these, what I see as two kind of parallel discourses about, so many kids still living with their parents. But on the other hand, you have a lot of conversation about Nepo babies, right? And I think that, this intergenerational challenge of passing on advantages is one that we see very starkly in terms of housing, in the form of kids going back to live with their parents after college or during college. And, I think that it does feel like there is a very different charge to those conversations now. And especially, I think, since 2008, the housing crisis really elevated these issues to the forefront of politics, but also made clear how precarious that plan of resting your whole wealth on your home, on home equity, on rising housing prices can be, and how unsustainable it is, especially as you try to pass your property on to the next generation, or sell it and then pass some wealth on. It just becomes so heated as a political point.
So I'm so glad you brought up the housing crisis, which is probably a weirdly enthusiastic way to respond to the housing crisis. But one of the things that we were looking at with the poll was not just kind of how people felt now, but how it compared to how they felt, 15 years ago, a little bit more than 15 years ago. In some cases, I think the earlier one we were looking at from the Massing polling group was in 2003. But one of the dynamics that was really interesting is the sort of how would you say you compare to a year ago, your household, and how do you think you're going to be doing a year from now? And when they asked this in 2011, so basically like coming out of that crisis, most people were like, okay, I'm not like doing as well as I was a year ago, but there was this sense of optimism, or a bit more of a pronounced sense of optimism, both in terms of I'm doing better than my parents. I think I'll be doing better a year from now. Whereas now there's this idea of I'm less likely to be doing as well as my parents. I'm doing worse than I was a year ago. I don't think I'll be doing as well now. And so I guess my question is, how do you think about the middle class as something that is amorphous versus like rooted in a particular concept? Because it seems like it changes based on era, what that precarity feels like. And so if the middle class is sort of connected to that idea of uncertainty and precariousness, then, does that mean our definition of the middle class also is kind of changing over time with era?
Yeah, I think the word is overused, but I think we could also talk about a kind of trauma, that for the generation that lived through the Great Depression, that middle class trauma was primarily over the security of having a job, right, and of consumption. And so you see those two elements really come to the fore in terms of defining what it means to be securely middle class. And perhaps the generations, our generation, millennials, Gen Z, coming up Gen Alpha, and I teach, so it's been alarming to see successively year by year my students not remembering 2008 as an event.
Oh boy.
Which can be a good thing. I mean, it was obviously traumatic for a lot of people. And so if they don't remember it, hopefully that means that their family didn't have too much difficulty coping with 2008. But even if they weren't directly experiencing it, I think that trauma lives on. And so I think that the fear of losing one's home or of having to, try to sweat out mortgage payments, of seeing housing prices collapse and then climb out of reach, all those kind of events, I think will shape those three generations for years to come.
And what's going on? You may not have a clean answer on this one, but we've been trying to kind of get our finger on it, which is what is going on with the idea that in a place kind of as expensive as Massachusetts, we understand we've got a pretty severe cost of living crisis and housing crisis, and we have, simultaneously excellent healthcare, but it's also quite expensive. Good childcare, but it's hard to access or very expensive. A nice life if you can get it is sort of what we keep coming back to. What is going on that there are people in Massachusetts who make anywhere from, $75,000 a year to, mid six figures that are sort of all describing themselves as feeling that level of class anxiety, that uncertainty about whether they can kind of afford to stay where they are, because that feels like a really big gap. Like there's very different experiences happening at either end of that spectrum, but they're all saying they're middle class.
Yeah, that's one of the real difficulties, I think, with any kind of analysis of the middle class is how various the experiences of precarity, but also of achievement are. Thinking that you've made it can mean something very different for people at the either end of that continuum. And periodically, somebody makes a comment that reveals, on social media or something, their privilege, as the lingo goes. And you even have like pro athletes, like Odell Beckham Jr. a few months ago talking about how he couldn't live on a $100 million contract. But
would that we all?
Yeah, right. Consumption grows with increased income, and your sense of what a necessity is obviously changes. But it's difficult for me not to feel like there is some degree of a lack of self-consciousness at the upper end of that scale. And I think that in the United States, we do have a lot of awkwardness about differentiating the middle class from the very wealthy, or even the pretty wealthy. And that kind of goes to what I was saying about two of those four dimensions, education and occupation. There really is no way to distinguish between a middle class person and a wealthy person. On those dimensions. They're not there to distinguish, to make that distinction. They're there to make the distinction the other direction. So I guess on a personal level, I feel like, cry me a river. But I think that analytically also there's maybe more fuzziness than there needs to be, because we're not making clean distinctions where we actually could.
Right. And one of the things that came up as I was reporting out on the poll was, particularly in periods like we're seeing right now, where the hiring market looks so terrible, is it feels as unstable and unsteady to be basically at any rung of that ladder. And then the question is, is that rung of the ladder technically something that fits inside the middle class? But I guess my question, kind of to stick to the historian brain part of this for a second, is where did and how useful was that sort of American dream framing when we were thinking about the middle class? Did that sort of serve a marketing purpose? Was that something that people actually thought they could get? Was it easier to get at the time that it sort of became associated with that imagery?
Well, the American dream as a phrase has a very clear beginning in the early 20th century. And I guess it reaches its apogee, its dominance in the post-war period. And I think that, as I was saying before, the way that the Depression shaped people's experience of what it meant to be middle class, I think that there were more standard and more achievable markers for that in the form of home ownership and a level of consumption that was pretty well understood to be universal, regionally, urban, rural, certain electronic devices, at least one car. Those were things that, were kind of binary. You either had or you didn't. And so, while certainly people had anxieties about falling out of the middle class, about being able to afford car payments or mortgage payments, things like that, I do think that it was a bit more obvious what being middle class meant. And I do think that was because the American dream was clearer in terms of who could make that level of achievement. And that does bring up the very different experiences of different groups of people in the United States and whether they could make those markers work for them or achieve those markers. So we haven't talked about issues of race and the way that they intersect, but clearly that would be a complicating factor, even in this period where it seemed much more clear-cut.
Right. That was, I think, where there were two more things that I wanted to get to. And one of them was, of course, you can't really talk about the history of housing without also talking about the history of redlining and exclusionary policies, basically. So if you're promising people that the middle class looks like owning a house in the suburbs, but, certain people historically over time were not able to get that house in that suburban area, or that it was harder because of other factors that were more kind of tied to demographics than anything else, it makes that pitch more complicated. Am I sort of on the right track on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's probably a certain degree of feedback there where the fact that who could be in these neighborhoods was clear. Also made their utility as middle-class distinguishing markers clear as well. So I guess to put it in plainer terms, I think that the whiter the middle-class ideal seemed to be, the more secure people who achieved that could feel that they belonged, that they were securely middle class, and they knew that was likely to be recognized anywhere.
I think the last thing is just this concept that we've sort of been toying with in the newsroom that's kind of connected to the intergenerational theme that we've been talking about here, which is, does what a middle class life look like now, or what people sort of conceive of it as, again, the combination of an economic standard of living and kind of a cultural signifier, does that look the same when you're in a situation where, home ownership prices or the cost of living or something like that is going to be bad no matter whether or not you're kind of like near a city or in an urban center or outside of one? And is there now a more diffuse concept of the middle class? Like, is someone who is able to own a condo in the middle of downtown Boston middle class in the same way that someone who owns a condo, out in Western or Central Massachusetts, or, you're in New Hampshire, thinking about kind of the New England spread there, is the middle class clearly signaling the same thing to different generations anymore?
Yeah, I mean, another factor that I think allowed for a clearer standard set of middle-class markers in mid-century, mid-20th century would be media, would be television and movies, and the way that could disseminate a picture of middle-class life. And the fact that there were only, 3 channels that you could view that middle-class life on made for a much more unified picture. And I do think that geography has become, a more splintering or fracturing force in terms of the way that certain housing markets are just out of reach for people. But I think also our media consumption gives very different pictures because now it's not just the TV shows or movies that are produced, but it's also live streaming of people's houses and the way that can distort perceptions of what middle class life is like, because a lot of it is curated in ways that aren't immediately visible or obvious, and children are absorbing that from a very early age, and I think that kind of fracturing of our media environment makes for a lot more confusion. So, yeah, I think diffuse is a really good word. I think chaotic is perhaps also another word that we could use. I mean, these are themes of uncertainty and insecurity that are perennial, but I do think that there are some forces, some economic forces, but also some forces in terms of the representation of middle class life that are new and make it a whole lot more complicated.
All right. Well, we could honestly talk about this for a really long time, but then I would be holding our listeners hostage. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. I was so glad to talk through this with you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks again to Andrew Seal for joining me on the Codcast this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. And we'll be back very, very soon with a special episode this week for our 30th anniversary.